HQ-5, Visions for Scholarship on the History of Quantum Mechanics. So we have a great panel who I'm going to introduce in just a moment, but first I'll tell you the guiding questions that they've been asked to address in the remarks, which will last 5 to 8 minutes, and we'll have maybe a little bit brief discussion among the panel, and then we'll open it up to the floor. Or we could even copy the previous roundtable and just open it straight up to the floor. It's up to the panel. So the guiding questions are, what questions or directions do you see as especially promising or necessary for the future of scholarship on the history of quantum physics? Which conceptual or methodological approaches do you think could significantly enrich future scholarship on the history of quantum physics? And what do we need to ensure the stability or further consolidation of the history of quantum physics as a distinct research field? And so before I introduce the panel, I just like to say that these are questions that the people who have designated this an IYQ global event are interested in. There's something that I'm very interested in as the director of the history program at the American Institute of Physics. I'm not a historian of quantum mechanics by background. I've concentrated my work in other areas, but I'm extremely interested in how I can facilitate and advance this community's work, as well as how I can promote it to others. So with that, I'm going to take maybe about a minute to ask some of my own questions that can just hang over the proceedings, and you can take them up or not. I'm interested in issues such as how do we identify and broadcast what's exciting? I've seen incredible passion from this room during this conference. And how do we explain why it's exciting to people like me, to the physical sciences community, and to any others who might be interested? Do we, amongst ourselves, foster the respect and honesty to see where progress in our work may have stalled over time? This is a 6-decade-old historiography a couple of days ago. And I think we do owe it to ourselves to ask, when have we maybe beaten the horse to death a little bit? How can we best preserve and interlink our scholarly gains, especially as we broaden our horizons beyond the central drama, the quantum revolution of 100 years ago? We've seen temporally, we're reaching closer to the present. We are reaching geographically broader spaces. And really exciting to me is the focus among a broader community of scientists. I'd like to introduce the word prosopography to the proceedings, which entails the study of scientific communities, which can entail methods such as group biography and statistical analysis of broader communities. How do we foster constructive conversation between strikingly different styles? I actually am not too worried about that because we've seen a lot of that at this conference, and I think I've seen a lot of that kind of constructive conversation. How do we update our scholarly infrastructure for the 21st century? This is something that I'm very interested in because we have conferences such as this one, books, articles, but it's the 21st century. We have the internet. We have lots of different possibilities. This physicist, after all, who came up with the internet, the World Wide Web, and used it for things like the physics archive preprint distribution many decades ago at this point. How can we take inspiration from that and find new ways of working together in near real time? How can we use these tools to build better bridges between historians, philosophers, physicists, science educators, and the public and other stakeholder groups? So I'll leave my liberties right there and now return the focus over to where it should be, which is the panel. The first member who I'll go by the order that they were on the program. So we'll start with Margriet van der Heijden, who is a professor of science communication in physics at the Applied Physics Department of Eindhoven University of Technology in the Netherlands. She has a background in particle physics, as well as long experience as a science journalist and writer. And over the years, more and more history has crept into her writings, she says. She has been active in the field of women in the history of science, and especially the history of physics over the past 10 years, culminating most recently, of course, as we've seen with the Women in History of Quantum Physics, or WIKIP project, of which she has chaired since mid-2024. Jinyan Liu is a professor at the Institute for the History of Natural Sciences at the Chinese Academy of Sciences. She earned her PhD in theoretical physics from the Institute of Theoretical Physics at the Chinese Academy in 2013. Her research focuses on the history of particle physics, with particular emphasis on high energy physics development in China. Her publications include a Chinese language monograph on Chinese physicists' development of the Stratton model, alongside papers on Sino-Soviet physics collaboration during the 1950s and 60s, and the role of prominent Chinese-American physicists, including Yang and Li, in promoting China's international science and technology exchange since the 1970s. Flavio de Santo is Senior Postdoctoral Schrödinger Fellow in Physics at the University of Vienna and the University of Geneva. He earned his degree in physics and astrophysics from the University of Florence and subsequently obtained both his master's and PhD in theoretical physics from the University of Vienna. His research interests span the foundations of quantum mechanics, quantum information theory, and the history of quantum physics. He's actively promoted the history of physics within the physics community as the organizer of several academic meetings, curator of the Bits of History blog of the Institute of Quantum Optics and Quantum Information in Vienna, editor of the special issue of the History of Physics in the European Physical Journal H, and director of the Visiting Exchange Program between HQ-5 in Vienna and the Max Planck Institute for the History of Science in Berlin. Finally, Bernadette Lessel. Her university studies at the University of Marburg in Germany were in theoretical physics and mathematics. After completing these, she consequently proceeded to do a PhD in mathematical physics, which she obtained in 2018 from the University of Göttingen. She's always mainly been interested in questions about the nature and foundations of physics and was able to start a postdoc at the Max Planck Institute for the History of Science soon after in Alexander Bloom's group. There, she received a thorough retraining as a historian of physics, focusing mainly on the history of unified field theory and of quantum gravity. In October this year, she started her second postdoc at the University of Bonn in Dennis Lemkuhl's group. And there she's been a member of the COGI project that investigates the so-called renaissance of general relativity. This wasn't what you wrote down, but since we mentioned the European Physical Journal for Flavio, you're also involved in that in the tandem contributions, which link contemporary developments and historical developments in the history of physics, right? Yes, terrific. So a very well qualified panel to look at the future, and this is a very well qualified room, so I'm really looking forward to the discussion. So we'll start with, we'll go in the order that I announced, and so we'll start with Margriet. Take it away.
It works. So thank you very much, Will, for the introduction and for inviting me to the panel, and also to all the others of the organization for inviting me on the panel. And I would also like to thank the HQP community for being so welcoming here. I struggled a bit with the questions because I think I do not have the very broad overview over the field of the history of quantum physics that would be required to address these questions in depth. But one thing that unsurprisingly I will mention here that is that it seems to me very promising and urgent also to continue to include gender and geographical aspects and perspectives. And personally, I think this HQ-5 conference was already a wonderful illustration of what it can bring if you do so. And I think as the many talks this week have made clear, such new perspectives require new methods. And also, I think some introspection. I think you referred to that already in your introduction, in the sense that each field and each human being has his or her or their blind spots that we are not aware of. And even though we have become aware of some of those blind spots today, such as women and geographical regions outside Central Europe, I would say, and the United States, that doesn't mean that we will have other blind spots in the future. Anyway, to come back to the perspective of women in the history of quantum physics, I think it would be wonderful if we could further extend the work beyond biographies and raise novel questions such as about, well, they were asked this week already, networks between women, sisterhood and competition, for example. And I also think that the many talks this week illustrated how fruitful it can be to contextualize all these contributions that have so often been overlooked. Women's contributions were not only overlooked systematically by contemporaries who underestimated women's contributions or downplayed them, The talks also showed how women usually did not reach the highest ranks in academia for all sorts of reasons, and therefore didn't have a secretary or assistant that could, for example, organize and archive the letters that children or that people from the audience at large would send them, as was the case for Bohr, for example. They also often did not have examples or widely accepted images, such as that of the romantic genius that has also been discussed this week, that they could model themselves after. And as a result, their paper trail, whether it consists of the letters of others, of correspondence, or of autofiction, is often small, it's scattered, it's difficult to trace. And that brings me to novel tools and methodology. I think it will require a lot of creativity and stepping aside of the standard path through archives, and perhaps, for example, AI may be of help to systematically find the very sparse occasions in which women were mentioned in the letters and correspondence of others. And moreover, I think it will also be important to strengthen the collaboration with scholars from other fields, such as gender studies or the social sciences. And last but not least, all of this is, of course, also true for the geographical perspectives. And I think many of the contributions this week showed how the contributions of women and their reception were very much determined by the context of space and time. So the context of the space and time window in which these women worked. And I think that WikiP, but also this week, has shown how fruitful sharing all these different perspectives is. Do I still have time? Yeah. So even better would be if these new perspectives could be included right from the start when turning the attention to other novel questions that are of interest to the future. And during the what I found very inspiring panel last Tuesday, the relevance of studying the quantum and technology, the quantum technology revolution, often called the second revolution, was mentioned. And it has been addressed in various talks already, also this morning. I enjoyed it very much. Let me ask here some more overall and perhaps a bit superficial questions that also relate to my chair in science communication. I think that some relevant questions for the future could also be, who determines the research agenda and what does that do to academic freedom? Or to unpack that a little bit, in many places, and I'm now not so much talking about the second half of the 20th century, but about our century, all these technological activities are organized in ecosystems with startups, big tech companies, universities, and research institutions, all enmeshed. And that ecosystem is laid over the traditional academic grid in which universities and research institutions are the hub. And they also take away some of the responsibilities of these traditional research institutions. And who then defines the research agendas of the researchers, who funds the research, and to what extent will researchers still be allowed to determine their own research questions and lines? And in a way, one would like to have some anthropologists or writers already present in these ecosystems to jot down what happens, and also people who know how to archive documents, because this also takes place in a completely different way. And I thought that maybe the HQ-5 community could offer useful advice here. So reach out to the outer world. It's something that you also mentioned in your introduction a bit. And that brings me to my very last point, that as a professor of science communication, I'm interested in the image that people have of scientists, in the trust they put in scientists, but also in scientific institutions and in the scientific method. And those are three very different things that can also be trusted in very different manners. And this week, during many talks, we saw many different images of the scientist. We saw a range going from the romantic genius to the mystic physicist prophet come by. But what will happen if the audience at large, and also more and more scientists themselves, will turn to ChatGPT and its successors and AI to find answers to their questions? What will the public image of a scientist become? What will increasingly large collaborations do to that images of the scientist? And will the image, or will the individual scientist disappear out of sight behind all this new technology and vanish? And what will autofiction then look like? How will young new generations, how will they model themselves? How will they shape themselves? What will be their examples? How can they model their career? How will they be defined? And these are questions that perhaps HQ-5 doesn't have to address, but where the insights of HQ-5 gathered over many decades could be extremely useful, I think. So again, I would say that the relevance of the field could also be to reach out to the fields of science education, science communication, and all these people in the social sciences that studies topics like trust in scientists. So in order to keep HQ-5 lively and solid and relevant, I think interdisciplinarity, multidisciplinarity, and reaching out and having as broad many as perspectives as possible are the key issues. Thank you.
Thank you, Margriet, for your very insightful ideas. So it's my great honor to participate in this roundtable discussion. So firstly, I would like to thank Calamero and AIP for organizing and supporting these two extremely successful conferences. I also extend my gratitude to Daniela and Alexander Bloom, although he's not here, for organizing this meaningful roundtable discussion. I think 2 days ago, we reviewed research achievements in the history of quantum mechanics over the past decades, and today we focus on our future developments. So then I will share some personal perspectives, which may be very somewhat limited. So I appreciate your understanding in advance. Just like Will introduced, I earned my PhD in theoretical particle physics in 2013, and later shift my focus to the history of physics. What initially drew me to physics were the elegance and depth of its equations, such as Maxwell equations, the equations of relativity, quantum mechanics, the standard model of particle physics. So these concise formulas describe the macroscope and the microscope worlds. However, as I approach it to completion of my doctorate, the HC experiment had just discovered the Higgs boson, which were the most important particle predicted by the standard model. Then the particle physics community soon faced the question of how to advance in the post-Higgs era. The field clearly lost some of its former excitement. In fact, we knew that the Nobel laureate Jinyan, who declared as early as in the 1980s that the party of particle physics is over. So it was during this period that I developed a strong interest to the history of physics. When one dives into the frontier of modern physics, it's natural to wonder how the field evolved. So by reading the original papers, in particular, made me deeply aware that the history of physics is far from as straightforward and logical as textbook presented. My first experience in a history of physics conference was just before the pandemic began in the beginning of 1920s, there is a workshop which was held by the Max Planck Institute. So at that time, I was an outsider in this field. It's difficult for me to catch up with most of the talks. So at that time, I feel very frustrated. However, I insist on paying more attention to this field and making small progress in these years. So that's why I truly cherish this opportunity to participate in this year's two conferences. So now please let me return to today's roundtable discussion theme, visions for the scholarship on the history of quantum mechanics. So firstly, I think although there has been extensive research on the history of physics in the first half of 20th century, especially with the AIP archives and oral interviews and the previous HQ conferences, there still remain more work to be done in the latter half of 20th century. I think topics related to the history of quantum field theory, the standard model of particle physics, condensed matter physics, as well as quantum technologies such as quantum optics, all of this deserve deeper exploration. Additionally, unlike there were only a few research centers during the birth of quantum mechanics, I think the physics development in the late 20th century became increasingly globalized and localized. So knowledge circulation and scientific diplomacy also present fascinating questions. Moreover, I think we should consider forming large collaborative research projects or research centers around shared interests. This would bring together groups of scholars to work on common questions, which requiring regular meetings and training for the next young generation. The teams by Jürgen Rönn, I think, and also Alexander Bloom at the Max Planck Institute, and also here the Brazilian Oliva's school, I think they already set an excellent model for us to follow. By the way, I also think the study of the history of physics should return to physics itself. It's not to deny the importance of social context. We must remember that we are historians of physics, and physicists are our primary collaborators and audience. By focusing on the internal development of physics, we are also considering external factors. We can create richer and multi-dimensional historical narratives. In China, I think the history of science once emphasized the collaboration with historians, but it became clear that historians often have the shortage of deep understanding of physics. So that's why now we engage, for myself, I engage myself to search for support from the Chinese physicists. Actually, the study of modern physics history is still a new discipline in China. I think its foundation and the resources remain weak, and much of the previous work we did is involves translating foreign scholars' publications. But now, fortunately, I think the Chinese physicists care deeply about the history of physics. They understood that to advance the frontier of physics in China, they must look back and learn from past experience. As a result, so they have provided strong support for research of history of physics in this field in China. So myself and Professor Daniel have promoted the Chinese Physical Society to organize the forum on history of physics, which have been highly, I think, effective in bridging the gap between physicists and the historian of physics in China. So in the past, we received tremendous encouragement and support from international scholars in integrating our small community into this global network. So I hope you will continue to support us, and we will also do our best to organize workshops, international symposium, and provide a platform in China for our international exchange. Thank you so much. That's what I want.
Yeah, thank you. I want to thank who spoke before me for these very nice introductions. And I want to thank the organizers, and particularly Daniela and Alex Bloom for inviting me here. It's really, I'm delighted. Yeah, so I want to start by somehow sharing my my own perspective on the history of physics, my experience with the history of physics. As a matter of fact, I still work, and I've always worked actively as a researcher in physics, and I have pursued a parallel career, let's say, on history of physics, or this is how this is perceived from the outside, leaving us in such a compartmental way of producing knowledge. But the way I perceive my own activity, it's kind of a whole. So since I'm a researcher in quantum foundations, we should acknowledge that these are treating problems that have, and by now, a historical dimension. I'm researching on problems that are open for 100 years, 90 years, Bell inequalities for 60 years. And so I believe that, and not only this, but actually my interest in the foundations of physics came from the history of physics. So I first started delving into the history, and then I thought these problems were extremely important. And afterwards, I understood that they were not solved at all. So somehow history can be an inspiration for new physics. And I'm not alone in this, although we are probably very few who did this, but I want to mention also Markus Aspelmayer, who's a leading physicist at the University of Vienna, who publicly always acknowledges his involvement with the Max Planck Institute for the History of Science in Berlin in the past, who led him to his research that is a state-of-the-art research on texting quantum gravity on tabletop experiments nowadays. These also came from history. So we're probably very few, but this can happen, and I think should happen. So this is what led me, together with Bernadette, to kind of propose a new approach to history of physics together with physics, which we called history for physics. I want to give you an impression of what this is. So I would like to read two passages from two publications. The first one by Bernadette of this special issue that we co-edited. So Bernadette says, historical analysis allow for critical engagement and independent logical analysis based on factual evidence, which can be extremely useful in clarifying fundamental conceptual and programmatic issues. One realizes that the familiar concept has not always been that way, but that it has been changed by all kinds of influences over time. These kinds of insights shift our perspective on what is perceived as eternally given and externally determined, and what in turn can be seen as historically contingent and thus open to critique and rethinking. In this sense, the practice of history can be empowering. It can restore agency to the individual researcher with the highly specialized and formally as well as programmatically determined enterprise of contemporary physics. So this is really what we advocate, is to have a deep and active engagement between these two communities. So while acknowledging the history of physics as an independent scholarship, and this should remain this way, we believe this should not be carried out independently of what physics is doing today. And I will read the second passage, and maybe I will try to motivate a bit more why this should be the case in our view. So this is a blog entry where of this blog I curated at the Institute of Quantum Optics, Quantum Information in Vienna. There we have a blog called Bits of History, and I wrote in this blog. So what can history and physics concretely do for each other? First and foremost, the history of physics can serve as a genuine epistemic tool, offering novel insights into scientific ideas and enabling the discovery of unforeseen connections between them, connections that, in turn, can help stimulate the development of new physics. Moreover, history of physics has the crucial task of providing a context. It supplies the global picture to position physicist research in the general status of their discipline, so one can understand on what tradition their ideas stand. It allows an informed comprehension of the acceptance or rejection of useful concepts and the goal that a community has established. It moreover investigates how and why specific concepts and ideas have been developed, ultimately reminding us that science is a human activity and that knowledge is effectively the result of a historical process rather than a logical one, as it is often naively portrayed among scientists. Indeed, as pointed out by Craig, history of science can give us a useful reminder that the forms in which science is carried out today are not the only forms possible, but the socially conditioned selection among many alternatives. And this last passage is really the conclusion of the whole piece. It says, reflecting on the past can uncover unexpected patterns, offering fresh inspiration for the development of new scientific ideas and contributing to a modern theory of knowledge, one that fully acknowledges the responsibility of science. And this last sentence is particularly important to me, and I will come back to this in a moment, the responsibility of science, because this, I think, is where history plays an important role. So we think that this can really be a mutual beneficial activity to engage between historians and physicists. We believe that for the historians, this can be extremely important to. So history is not just a collection of facts. Otherwise, we will just collect everything that happened and we will repeat history. We will copy history today on a day-by-day basis. It's a selection, it's an analysis. And this is also important to be carried out in relation to what became important nowadays. So having historians that participate and are aware on the state of the art physics help them also understand what things were important back then that led to the development to the history of these ideas, or otherwise why certain ideas that they were there did not take place today. So it's history, it's a relation between the past and the present, is not only about the past. So let me just say something very quickly, what we have done in this direction, and I believe that I'm trying to address what this panel is about. So the future for me is going in this direction, trying to include more and more collaborations and interplay between physics and history of physics. So with Bernadette, we started this series by organizing two. Just can you go to the next slide? I'm changing on my computer. Yes. So here on the right-hand side, you see these are the posters of two symposia we organized in 2019, one in Vienna and one in Potsdam, on history for physics, focused on quantum foundation, and the other on quantum gravity, where we initiated this idea of tandem talks. So we were asking historians of physics to be paired with physicists who would together deliver talks. The physicist in the role of a physicist, not playing a historian. So the physicist was explaining a certain problem, certain idea, certain piece of work that they were conducting, the state-of-the-art research, and the historian would give the contextualization of how this developed. So this was, I think, quite successful. We had important names in both in the physics and the history of physics, like Frere, Kaiser, Peter Hofer, Hoffman, Hoffman, and who was, and Alex Bloom. Yes, these were the keynote. Let's see. Then this we brought this into the in print, this same idea, and so we decided to get together with Bernadette again to co-edit this special issue. So in the EPJH, again, on history for physics. And we had an open call where we were inviting what we call tandem papers. So the same idea that we had in the talks, to actually put this in print, and so have sustained collaboration between historians and physicists who wrote together papers. And I want to say that this is, although the special issues ended, this remained as now a section of the EPJH, edited by Bernadette. So you can keep an eye on that. And if you're interested in pursuing this view that we're proposing, what the only thing that's still active in the history for physics at the moment is Bernadette's part of the EPJ that you can address if you want to be paired with a physicist for a project together. And finally, I want to mention that we had for 3 years this scholarship offered between the Max Planck in Berlin on the history of science and the Institute of Quantum Optics and Quantum Information in Vienna. We had this exchange program that I was leading, where historians could, and I think this is something that we should try to pursue more, to have historians spending time to do research and offering talks in physics institutes. Yeah, Gonzalo and Mercedes were part of the beneficiaries of this program, and Bernadette, myself, to go to Berlin. And yeah, so physicists could go to an institute of history of physics and the other way around, so to have really to see how we work and how this is carried out. So I have somehow yeah, so I truly believe that this is a way, one possible way to go for the future of scholarship in history of physics. I have some questions now. Maybe I can ask to you to further foster the in this behalf, in this topic. So whether it is possible somehow, so which other initiatives can be carried out, and can we structure this more? Can we institutionalize this idea of a mutual exchange? Yeah, so also because, so another thing is how to find historians who would like to participate in something like this, which is something that we already had as a concrete problem. I mentioned it in the other panel. We were often in several cases not able. We were contacted by physicists who would have liked to do such a project, and we were not able to find historians that were competent on that field. So on the one hand, maybe there is not as many historians of physics than physicists, but also was hard for us to reach out. So having a more systematic overview of who are the historians of physics and on what they work could be really helpful for such kind of collective activities. And another question is, do all approaches to the history of physics benefit from this? So in this, so certain approaches that can be like really history of culture and not deal with the content of physics itself, how would they engage in such a program? And this, I'm interested to hear some perspective on this. And finally, I want to go back to the responsibility of science, because I think that is something. So I'm very happy that finally gender studies and geographical cultural studies are getting into the field more prominently. This panel shows that respect with the one of the first 20 years, the one of the next 20 years is women and gender neutral led. This I'm very happy, but I think we should also come back to include more politics in our activities. So I come from a tradition of history of physics that was developed in the 1970s from a Marxist school, which was mostly led by physicists who started being completely dissatisfied by the way that physics was pursued at the time. On the one hand, in a very capital intensive way, and on the other, addressed to military, so the military industrial complex demands. And they developed the concept of a non-neutrality of science, and they made thorough reconstructions on how science has been developed hand in hand with industrial and capitalistic society. and for the demands of the military. And nowadays we live in a world which is where 1/4, according to the UN, of the population lives in places that are afflicted by armed conflicts. We are watching the first broadcasted genocide in the history of humankind, where this massacre in Palestine has been carried out, plus the war between Russia and Ukraine and the whole NATO backing it up. We are living in, I'm afraid that in the next 20 years, this will be also part of our culture. And on the one hand, every person of goodwill should take a position in this. But I mean, I believe that intellectuals have the privilege that should use it. It's a moral obligation of the intellectuals that have this privilege of having the tools and the time for addressing complex problems should not stay silent. And while the scientists are directly involved, the working physicists are directly involved in the production of new technology that goes into military, historians should give them the perspective, because physicists are trained as I said, in a dry logical form of knowledge, and I believe it's the responsibility of historians to bridge this gap and to remind constantly the scientists of how science is developed and where it goes. And I just want to finish with this somehow. Next slide, please. So this, it was already mentioned, the Helgoland 2025, and I was there. And when I arrived, I was informed by Carlo Rovelli, who was also a speaker and also an activist with whom we share this International Union of Scientists Against Militarization and the Misuse of Science and Technology. So we were made aware that this conference was also co-founded by two American military agencies. And so I decided to turn my scientific poster backwards and to improvise a scientific poster called The Elephant in the Room, where I reminded them that we're not only celebrating 100 years of quantum mechanics, but also 80 years from the US bombing and the massacre in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and 70 years from the Russell-Einstein Manifesto, and physicists who knew SEEN should have paid a bit more attention to their history and take responsibility for what they do. So thank you very much.
Okay, thank you for the three of you for providing so many interesting perspectives and ideas already. I will try to add something meaningful to this, and to make up for having prepared too much yesterday, I will actually try to make it short today. And also, as Flavio nicely covered some of the things I could have also said. So in my pitch, I would like to actually merge the three questions that were given to us into one, in a way that I will not address specific research questions that I find interesting, because I don't want to impose my own interest too much, actually, which is what I originally wanted to do when I said yes to the panel. Instead, I would like to focus a bit more on the question of methodology or approach to the history of quantum physics, perhaps actually a bit more general to the history of physics, because, and I think this is something we could perhaps discuss in the audience, if we should really think of the history of quantum physics as a distinct field. It's nice to have conferences dedicated on this, but I'm not sure if we should see it as a distinct field, or if we should think more broadly on the future of the history of physics in general. So I would like to start by quoting actually something that Thiago said in the panel that we had in the beginning of the conference, which is that that we have a diversity of approaches is something good. This is something that we should embrace and that we should keep. And I full-heartedly agree to this. When I entered the field after having finished my PhD in mathematics, I was so amazed by this freedom and this variety of approaches and methods to answering historical questions. I think this is an intellectual liberty which is really rare compared to other fields. For example, mathematics, where the scientific practice is very narrow. There's a very specific thing you have to do and how you have to execute it. So I think this is a strength that we should embrace. But I think also, like, in terms of embracing all kinds of approaches to the history of physics, let me stay in this more general level. I think this also means an inclusion of a more internalist type of history. And and even though Daniela advised me not to emphasize this too much, I would still would like to try doing this. Because I think this is what I'm mostly doing, and I agree that there are ways to do an internalist type of approach, which are maybe not so good and maybe not so interesting also, and are problematic. But I also think that there are that there are very interesting ways to do this, and that this should not be regarded as a fetish or as as something outdated. And I would like to provide perhaps a perspective, at least my perspective on this type of approach, which perhaps makes it a bit more appealing. And well, as I said, I came originally from mathematical practice. And the reason why I did not continue being a mathematician was exactly this, that there was no space for foundational questions. And I'm very happy that within history, I do have this space to asking foundational questions along the lines that Flavio, the quote that Flavio has read from the introduction to the special issue. And I think it is necessary that there is this space to engage with the foundational questions. For me, this is even a better space than philosophy would provide, because this sometimes ahistorical philosophical practice is not very interesting to me on the one hand side. And to add something that Christoph just told to me, which I completely agree, is that philosophers are sometimes even indistinguishable to physicists themselves. So I'm to me, this is very precious, having this space, and I feel very sad if people see this as an outdated practice and would like to see it maybe well, shrink down, or well, don't regard it as something useful. And of course, I totally get the point and fully agree that there are also other ways to address foundational questions, not only from a purely internalist perspective, but also within a more contextual frame. And I think this is extremely intriguing if someone manages with a more external approach, or with including external factors to the story, to address a foundational question within physics. And I'm all up for this. Yes, as I said, I think this is extremely intriguing, but I don't think it's always possible to include also, or to consider also, external factors. And I also don't think it's always necessary to include external factors. So this being said, perhaps the actual distinction, or that the distinction that is maybe maybe more fruitful than distinguishing between an internal type of approach or external type of approach is the question whether or not there is an epistemic interest in physics proper, or whether or not one is actually interested in the content of physics. And I think and I agree that not all types of history need to be concerned with physics proper and need to have an epistemic interest in physics. But and now I would like to pick up a question that Indianara asked at the other panel. If people are afraid to pick up, for example, well, gender type of perspectives in physics, and I sometimes wonder if people are maybe afraid to actually deal with physics proper in their studies. And I would like to encourage actually, especially people who are interested in external type of perspectives, to engage with epistemic questions within physics. And I think there, at least from my understanding of which type of work is out there, I think there lies true novelty. If this is possible, especially from a gender type of perspective, if these two things could be connected, I think this would be really great. And also, this is relating to, I think, what Jinyan said, and also what Flavio said, a very good occasion, an opportunity to reach out to physics and team up with them. For example, for people who have not had a proper training in physics, but have a good understanding of how a gender perspective looks like. I think it could be very fruitful to team up and see where you can get if you team up. So I think this is my main point, and I would like to conclude my thinking by responding to Jean-Philippe's, is he here? To Jean-Philippe's question he gave to the audience at the end of his presentation in the panel, which is what can we do to counter potential fragmentization that might come from diversity, or from embracing or having just a diverse amount of approaches. And I fully agree with what Jean-Philippe said. It's very important to stay in touch and to just be aware and to engage with people's work. And but a bit more general on the level of ideas, I guess, how one could encounter this is, I think that one should really celebrate diversity and see it as a strength and not something to worry about or something to worry about how it might divide us, but really see it as a strength and make diversity really the core of the identity of our field. Thanks.
Okay, thank you everyone for that very thoughtful discussion. I think you've gone through your time for a possible internal discussion, so I'm just going to open it up straight to a general discussion. I see that Elena is. We'll start with the back here.
Thank you so much for the variety of contribution to this question of visions for the scholarship. I'm a little bit worried because it's nice to talk about the visions, but what are the constraints to live out these visions? Because I think most of us operate in an environment where our research has to be funded. And then the question is, who is funding what kind of scholarship? And I think that for me became very pertinent in Flavio's presentation. How do we do research if we rely on maybe the funding that is coming from physics? And that can be positive, but it can also be restrict how we do physics. Because I think as much as I would love to say that there's an openness and I would love to maybe collaborate more closely with physicists, doing masculinity studies and coming from a cultural background, which are two explicitly different things, it is very difficult to actually start a conversation sometimes, because there is still a barrier that has to be dismantled in order to start a conversation. And I think it also comes from that maybe gender studies is seen as too political, but also not as political enough. Because I think we cannot distinguish that very much. And if we look at the history of women's studies or gender studies, that it is coming from a very, very political point. And I think for us to actually live up to this potential that maybe these certain approaches have, we should have a certain type of freedom to conduct it. But sometimes we're just not funded to do so to the extent that we would like it to do. So I think there is a challenge between wanting to have diversity, but being unable to fulfill it because of the funding restriction and the institutions we work in.
Befuddled you?
Yeah, and so yeah, thanks for pointing this out. Yeah, I don't know. I don't know in the sense that in at least where in the field I work in quantum foundations, the gender issue is extremely stressed, extremely highlighted. There is now a consortia of women who are like women in quantum physics. So what I mean is that there will be for sure an interest in this. If you ask me about the funding agencies, it remains in the same structure that we all operate within, and but I'm not suggesting that you are paid by a physics institute at the moment. I'm suggesting that we join forces as you are a historian of physics, and so it's a matter of interest more than a matter of where you get the funding from, because also in the foundations of physics doesn't get a lot of fundings, and you have sometimes to I have to do publications in quantum information and quantum communication to survive, to do also quantum foundations. So I don't know what is the exact worry. I mean, we know that is a extremely bad situation, the way that knowledge is distributed and funding allocated, but I don't see it particularly difficult in this specific aspect. I don't see it.
I find it also difficult to respond to this because I also simply don't know. The only thought that I had is I see the difficulties in. I think that the field of quantum foundations is different to other fields in physics, maybe in terms of engagement with this type of topics. So I can see. Also the worry to reach out to physicists, but what would be the alternative to have a practice of gender in science and not talk to physicists about this? I think this is so one should try in any case, and I'm not saying it's easy. Yeah.
Maybe I can add one thing to this, and that is that the Women in the History of Quantum Physics is an international working group that is comprised of philosophers of science, of physicists, and also of scholars with experience in gender studies. So there's not so much always a juxtaposition, I think. And in such a collaboration, each one brings in their own perspective. That doesn't solve the funding problem, but it is one way to overcome the problem, in the sense that then, yeah, you divide the tasks, you share the load, and it becomes a collaborative burden and pleasure to work together.
Okay, the cues I have it as Clamario, Christoph, Roberto, Alexei, Elise. So we may have to have a sign-up sheet.
Well, first, thank you very much for this great and thought-provoking talks. I particularly love how Bernadette puts, like, in her provocation, like, are we afraid of engaging with epistemic questions in physics? And I've been trying to promote this dialogue. Even here, this gender studies, this social cultural studies are really very prominent. And I will be trying, one of the things we are pushing, like in Janara and I, we are discussing with our students, like we should engage with epistemic questions. If you're discussing gender, to how gender changed the content of physics. And I think this is really very important. So we have here, like, for me, the talk is like physics, history and physics are really connected in all the talks. Margriet talked both to this perspective also on science education, science communication. And I would like to emphasize, like, I believe in the power of our discipline if we choose to engage with meaningful questions for physics, but for society as well. And I think the path to engage with these meaningful questions is also paying attention to epistemics, to the content of physics, to bring epistemic questions and all, but also trying to bridge to understand the development of these epistemic questions in the social context. I think, so it's like a push for separating this dichotomy, internalism, externalism. I think it's, our discipline has this, like, as the whole grail of history of physics, right? And I would like also to acknowledge what Elena brings is like history of physics became unfashionable in many quarters. Like if you are a history of science department, historians of physics are quite often looked down upon, I think, at least my impression from several conversations with several colleagues. And as a community, I think we should choose to engage with meaningful questions in the sense also to bridge gaps, to create bridges with these other areas of other quarters of history of science in general.
Well, thank you so much, Clemerio. I don't think anything needs to be added to this. Yeah, yeah. Thanks, appreciate it.
Okay. Same for me.
All right, Christoph.
Yeah, two little things. I mean, one, I think is very much in line with what Clemerio already said, right? I think one thing that was implicit in all your sort of statements, but that is worth to make a bit more explicit is who are we talking to, right? Who is our interlocutor, not just our audience, but, you know, who are we conversing with? And that is a difficult question for a very interdisciplinary field. I don't think the answer should be only physicists, right? But, you know, I think one side remark, of course, we're most happy to talk to each other, right? That's, you know, it's a very nice community, but we do need and want to talk to others and other academic fields. But also, I think, you know, Margriet has an important point, you know, also to the general public, right? I think it is important, you know, that history of science should not just be an academic pursuit, but also, like, you know, some way to, like, you know, reflect about science in a way that, you know, also is accessible to the general public. And I think there, you know, there's a difficult but important issue of, like, you know, combining it with some kind of outreach between the academic bubble. And I don't think we can ever sort of, you know, there is no simple answer to all this, right? I don't think, you know, it's going to be either the physicists or the historians or the philosophers, right? There's always, like, all these different audiences that we somehow have to interact with. And, you know, in that regard, yeah, I think in the end also diversity is one important part of it, right? You know, that's the nice thing that, you know, different things will be attractive to different people. And the second totally unconnected point that I wanted to make is, right, how do we go in the future, right? I mean, obviously there is some important question how we, you know, go beyond the glorious 20s into, like, you know, the much more complex history of the post-war period. And I think one central problem is that the definition of quantum physics itself becomes much more unclear, right? I mean, you know, in the 20s, it's very clear who did quantum theory and who did not, or quantum experiments. In the 1950s, it's already, I mean, quantum physics is everywhere and it's nowhere, right? I mean, it's like, you know, it's in high energy physics, it's in solid state physics, it's, but it's not like it's not anymore the central focus of research, so it becomes a much more diffuse field. And I think, you know, that is one important question to think about, how we want to sort of, you know, translate our history of quantum mechanics into a time where quantum mechanics itself is becoming, you know, not very simply defined subfield of physics. I think that's a very worthwhile question to think about too.
I totally agree with your suggestion. The physicists is not only the audience of our research, philosophers and the public outreach is also very important for us. And also, I want to emphasize here, I think we also need to do our best to make the IUCHPP, our international organization, more influential. So, so I think we have tried our best to make our international organization more obvious and more crucial in the near future.
Can I add to this? So thank you very much. I agree with what you said. I was thinking about one more thing in relation to reaching out to the public at large and connecting it to what Flavio previously said. That if you think about the role that physics played and that also quantum technologies can play in the defense industry, or I don't know whether defense industry is a euphemism, I think so. But that one could also try to reach out to policymakers, to policymakers to provide them with the background, because the policymakers are the ones that decide, and very often on very well, on grounds that have been lobbied for by many parties. I don't know how to do it, but it's something to reflect upon. And then the second point, how to keep the field together when quantum physics is entering a new era and is at the basis of so many different subdisciplines and technologies. In our Women in the History of Quantum Physics project, we had a very broad definition, but we of course had as a point of focus that all contributions should have come from women. So we won't have that for the field at large, and I think it's a truly crucial point. And I think maybe what Flavio and Bernadette were saying may have more also the study of the foundations, or look for where there is some foundations, but I should give the mic to you, could be a starting point to think about this question.
Yes, I completely agree. This is a very important question, your second question, Christoph. Yes, so we haven't really addressed this. One reason why I did not address this in this specific way is what I said in the beginning. I'm not sure how it makes sense to distinguish this subfield history of physics so much from the broader history of physics anyways. And then also aligning with what Jean-Philippe said in the panel, that I think there's already efforts going on to broaden the scope of quantum a little bit. I think Jean-Philippe gave very nice examples, and this of course needs to continue. Yeah, that's what I think about this.
Yeah, I don't want to take too much time. I agree with most you said. Indeed, I think this can be seen as an opportunity. The fact that physics enlarged the scope so much after the World War II history could enlarge its scope. We need more historians to cover all the things. Yeah.
Thank you. Okay. How is the, okay, here. So thank you very much for this wonderful set of views and provocative in some sense. So what I miss strongly is that when we need some reflection on the institutional setting, which might allow any future of the field at all. In the sense, the talks which were given were mostly, as far as I understood, most on the history of contemporary physics. Everything you said could be on the history of contemporary, it was not specifically quantum. So one question, do we need a specific quantum history at quantum physics at all, and which resonates? It might be connected to quantum foundation, quantum computing, quantum technology, and of course, quantum mechanics. But we need to define if it makes sense to have a sub-community which is still connected to the quantum physics, so we simply give up and go to the future for contemporary physics. And this is one problem, which maintains, I think, everything you said. I mean, but I didn't see anything which was specifically quantum in what has been said. So how to define the field? This is a problem. How it is connected to community, and this is the second issue connected to the first one, because the fields, the community, in broader sense, might be really considered the same thing. There is epistemic level, but there are a lot of people which consider themselves working on these questions at this level. But on the institutional is a little bit different. The institutional side, in my view, more problematic. There are, of course, this inter-union commission, which we will try to use to support the history of physics, more broadly understood, not necessarily quantum, but contemporary physics, certainly. But it resonates with Elena's, issue, which is not so much on the funding agents, but the position themselves. I mean, where those working on the history of contemporary physics might find position. If they find position in physics department, they will be very welcome to the very internalist and epistemic question. If they find their position in history department, history of science, well, philosophy department as well, that might be very much connected to internalist and epistemic question, but they found in another institutional setting, very much separated from physics, this kind of connection become much, much harder. So in the future, how do we can keep these two different, basically, sub-communities together? If it makes sense to keep them together, and from what perspective, but also how, as a community, can we find a way to see how the history of contemporary physics may find the institutional place? Many of us have had or have issue in finding some sort of tenure track or permanent position. This is a basic issue because physicists, okay, they may be interested in putting together better. Are they interested in giving a position, for instance, of physics? Well, in the last 20 years, in Italy, it's been very hard after you what you described, an interest. This is when they cut, when there was a cutting, basically none was hard for 20 years in the history of physics, not even in didactics. So now it's changing a little bit, but then again, really this little bit. Okay, this is also in the other place. Sorry, and concluding. So there are very local settings where physics is still interested, but in many settings, physics don't actually have position, including Germany. I don't think physics and history of physics entering physics department, which is a big, huge issue if you want to do an epistemic internalist history of physics. But
yeah, thank you, Roberto, for touching on this. I think it's extremely important, of course. I agree with the first part. I think I would probably, that solves a bit also with Christoph's problem of how to define quantum physics. It could be that contemporary physics as a whole could be more then of course, but there can be specialized workshops and people that do only quantum. But I think that I wouldn't go into defining this as really as a subfield to be even more fragmentalizing the field, which is not thriving, unfortunately, as you said. About the institutionalization, where to locate the historians of physics, I want, yeah, I don't know. I don't know. And I don't know how to pursue this further, but I want, since you mentioned the Italian situation, for instance, that we are aware of, but I want to share this. These people who created the field into the physics departments in the 70s, creating this new disciplinary sector didactics and history of physics, that now is rarer, but they were mostly externalists though. So there was a lot of course, epistemic questions inside physics, but they brought all the cultural aspects, the political struggles. So I don't think that this is necessary to do exclusive technical internalist history of physics if you work in a physics department. And this is something that we should also struggle for this maybe.
Yes, I completely agree that it's not, and I think this aligns with what Elena was asking, that it's nice on the one hand to think of which type of history we would like to pursue, while this strongly depends on the institutional situation, and this is maybe something we need to discuss first. However, this is an extremely difficult issue, and I don't think that a panel with 3 early career scholars can really contribute so much to this. I think the people one would need to talk to and maybe also hold responsible to are other people like Jürgen Renn, for example. So I think when you want to talk about this a bit more in depth and why this institutional situation is like it is and how it can be changed, I think other people should be sitting here. Yeah.
Should we continue with the question? Okay, so right now I've got Alexei, Elise, Richard, Michelle, Danyan, I think. We've got about 25 minutes left, so we're doing okay. Is there anybody who wants to adjust that queue order? Like we have something pressing that needs to be adjusted right now, or should we just go in order? All right, we're just going to go in order then.
Partially, it's a comment to Elena's question, but then we'll have a question to all kind of participants, including you, Will. So not just history of physics, history of science is a small field. Not just history of physics, but history of science has been always a small field. And my feeling was that its way to survival as a field was to be promiscuous, meaning that some people work in institutions related to humanities, some people work in institutions related to exact sciences, some people try to make alliance with philosophers, some people try to create their own institutes or institutions, kind of, and in different parts of the world, different countries, kind of, one may succeed more than the other strategies, but and each of these affiliations and funding had its own restrictions always been, and it affects kind of the approaches, kind of things, but kind of in sum together, kind of, it was creating this sort of I would say, promiscuity of approaches, kind of, and also the diversity of the source of funding. But that's kind of in general. But what strikes me about this panel, including the facilitator, that you're all the guys who had some contact with physics, or at least had it until recently, and then left for some, possibly because of some disappointment. So you kind of have more kind of a sense connection to physics. And there was a time when, let's say, in Italian universities, physics department had a position, full position of professor devoted to history of physics. It's past, that's no longer the case. There was a time when Max Planck Institute for Physics in München had also a full-time position for historian of physics, plus maybe 1 or 2 temporary position. There is a University of Copenhagen where the archive is linked to the physics department, so there's still, then Latin America often lives in a time scale which is not in sync with other parts of the world. So now we have in Brazil, where physics department kind of tolerate and kind of actually have kind of historians, and hence they kind of have a spike. But then who knows what will happen in 5 or 10 years, kind of. So things will change here or there. But I want to ask you, sort of, basically, it takes 2 to tango. If we talk about physicists, I mean, we may try to offer something to physics department. They will not necessarily like the advice or the mirror image that will show them as historians. But you, including Will, have recently been in contact with physicists. Can you give a comment about what do you think is going on there? what do you think is going on in physics department with regard to kind of I don't know what may the interest be, or how they mistakenly or not kind of what they think about kind of historical things, how they evaluate the state of the discipline, and what kind of a use of history they may look for now, if you have some anecdotes or just kind of a context of the debate.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I can speak in anecdotes, but so one of the things I told you that I started my presentation with is this thing with, for instance, in Vienna, Meyer, of course, is extremely supportive because he acknowledges that new physical ideas can come from historical investigation. So if some physicists would be convinced of this, of course, they would see the value of doing some history of physics in their department. Of course, this can be, again, more related to internalism, more related to technical history of physics. But again, I don't think it must be the case. And I believe actually that we should a bit surpass this categorization and try to do a good history of physics that encompasses contexts and talk about the field. But this is another big discussion. I want to bring another example. There is this, so there was a big consortium that ran for the last 3 years, quantum information structure of space-time, including, I don't know how many, like 30 research groups around the world, maybe more. And this was what was paying the visiting scholarship that I established together with Alex Bloom and Bernadette between Max Planck in Berlin and Vienna. And in that particular project, when they submitted it, so it was a John Templeton Foundation project for several million dollars. When they submitted, the reviewers encouraged them. They said that this physics, so it was about foundations of quantum gravity, let's say, okay, so new approaches to quantum gravity. Some of the reviewers invited them to include not only some philosophers, which are already included, but without a good historical contextualization, this cannot work. And that's how I've been somehow put into the project. I was not. So I was called by the physicists to accommodate the request of a reviewer to get the big money. But so in some sense, I guess there is some people who have the sensitivity to do so. We have just to find them and to kind of persuade them to take some action on this, because I don't think that this is completely unpopular, at least who works in foundations of physics.
Yes, I want to basically second this. I don't think there is a systematic interest in history within Physics Institute, but I think in each Physics Institute there are individuals who are interested, and I think it's important to locate them and reach out to them, and to somehow then also make the field a bit more known. I think one reason why there is not so much interest is that many physicists really actually don't know about this academic field of history of physics. So I think the ball is really in our court to promote the field amongst physicists. And also, I think maybe Jean-Philippe is is a good person to give some anecdotes about how the situation looks like. I don't know if you want to say something. Okay, maybe not.
Since Alexei opened the door to my saying something, I'll just say a few words about the American Institute of Physics, which I think is a very interestingly placed institution, because we are a physics institution at which no physics researchers work. Instead, you can think of us as essentially like a trust for the physics profession, wherein we do work that profession values. So English Physics Today, we've had a history program that's now been going on for 60 years and is well supported and respected. We have a Science Policy News Service that I used to work for 7 years. And when I took on the position as the director of our history program, they actually gave me an expanded remit. My official title is the Spencer R. Wirt Director of Research in History, Policy, and Culture. And the pitch essentially is that we'll bring the past and the present of the physical sciences enterprise into a stronger and more vibrant dialogue. Now, I mean, I'm just one person. So, that's not something that can happen overnight. But, really for the first 2 years that I've had this position, what I wanted to do is understand who, the history community is. I made a list of people. I came up with 400. I bet I could come up with at least 100 more. Some of you have probably gotten emails from me. If you have, that means that you're probably on that list. If you haven't, it means I need to add you yet, and you should be in contact. And so now I have the harder task of reaching out to the physics side of the operations. And we want to do that around this 100th anniversary of the quantum mechanics revolution by tapping into the enormous interest right now in quantum information science and quantum technologies to do contemporary history of that. And what we're going to do is send out a survey to key people so that we can just ask them basic questions. It's not a quantitative survey; it's a qualitative one. How did you get interested in the subject? What is your career trajectory like? And I'm open to suggestions on other questions we might ask, but we want it to be simple. We want the engagement from this community to be simple, because we can't ask them to read monographs. We have to create limited points of engagement. And from there, where we go, I don't know, but that's kind of the idea. And I risk cultivating a reputation for madness by kind of articulating the grand picture of the thing. But I think that's the outline of the overarching strategy on our end. Should I go to Elise? Margaret? Yeah. Yes. I think.
My own trajectory is so particular that I don't think my anecdote will add much.
Okay.
It's generally on the same theme, but Will, can we not use AI to sort of look for academic profiles of historians of science and sort of give a summary of their area of competence or specialty? Can be internal. Chris Woodley used to run a list for philosophers of physics, and I've used that list many times to make contacts with people who are working in a similar area as me. I'm not sure if he still does it, but it was a really useful tool for us for a while. It was kind of internal. It was on a website, but only a few of us, right. It was open to the public, but the public didn't super duper know about it, I guess. I'm just wondering, a lot of the conversation about the funding issues seem to be like larger term at like a 1-year postdoc or something. Can we start with smaller steps? Like going to your physics departments and asking to give a talk at their colloquium, or so they learn about what you do. Most departments have weekly colloquia, right? That's a wide practice. Okay. Having summer schools where you're literally throwing together maybe even an array of senior, middle, and early career scholars. Cecilia DeWitt used to organize for many, many years in Bavaria, or in a summer school. And I know that philosophy of physics does a summer school, and they sometimes have physicists who go to it. And that's where you make actual connections, personal connections with people, and you get interested in each other's work. And that can be funding like from John Templeton Foundation, other places. Like my experience is that for smaller projects that are labeled as interdisciplinary in a true sense, not like the chem engineering department is collaborating with the electrical engineering department, they're crazy about it. They're asking for it all the time. The NSF used to have that as a requirement for the small funding reviews. It is like, are you interdisciplinary? Are you reaching out to the people? And but they don't. Yeah, a lot of times the STEM fields didn't know there were people in philosophy and history working. But yeah, some smaller. Do you think something like that would be possible? I think funding for that sort of thing, shorter term, linking cross-career trajectories and cross-disciplinary trajectories, is that feasible for that? Also, do you guys know about DivvyQ? Flavio, did you meet Zula at? Okay, so there is a group called Diversity in Quantum. I think it's primarily physicists, but they're working really hard to build diversity and equity and inclusion in quantum. So divvyq.org.
The one that wrote the manifesto of women in quantum?
I'm not sure.
Okay. I know. Okay. All right. Makes sense. Okay. No, then No, but coming back, so some of these things you mentioned are feasible because some of them we have done. So what I was mentioning was this visiting program that was again quite successful, but now the money is over for that one, for instance. So, but I always encourage and I've always invited with my project money in physics, but I mean, I'm in the position of being also a physicist. I invited historians to give talks and colloquia, but I think this is definitely doable. So I think we should follow a bit the footprints of philosophers, because philosophers in the last decade made the cut into the physics community, at least for the foundations. Yeah, some. But so it's common now in foundations of physics conferences that there is one or two invited talks by philosophers. It's kind of absolutely normal. And there was a couple of years ago this article on PNAS, where there was several scientists, including Carlo Rovelli and several philosophers, that they wrote this article. What can philosophy do for physics and physics for philosophy, something like this, where there was a list of suggestions in the article, so bullet points where they were saying invite philosophers to physics conferences, co-organize summer schools. So some of these things, there was a list of pretty easy suggestions, I would say. Exactly. I know. But what I mean is that we should take the same list, substitute philosophy with history of physics, and then try to pursue this program. And I think this is absolutely doable. And this was actually the long-term plan for this history for physics for me was this, like trying to prepare the ground for bigger things. By the way, when I write project grants, proposals for grants, I always put the historical dimension, etc., etc. And as you said, I think that if you pack it as a transdisciplinary blah 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 blah, everybody is super excited about this. It's not is an asset. It's definitely not a bug nowadays if you pursue interdisciplinarity, even if maybe is most of the time just an advertisement or yeah. But I think that there are, at least for permanent positions, I would, as Bernadette said, I mean, I don't have it in any field, the permanent position, so I'm not the best person to talk about this. But for small initiatives, I think is definitely doable, and that's if we are interested as a community of historians, there is ways to get into to talk to the physicists and be invited and be consistently have sustained collaboration.
Yeah, so let me say something. I changed my mind. I will say something about my my own trajectory, but it is very different from yours. So I left particle physics in part because I was rather young. I had daughters. It was the 1980s. That was not. I didn't really feel that there was place for me. So I turned to science writing, and then I started out to work on my double biography on Paul Ehrenfest and Tatjana Afanasьева. I didn't have any funding. I funded myself. So I worked part-time, and I'm still doing that today, in fact. So my chair is a part-time chair, and part of the work, or well, probably a rather large part for WikiP is just in my own free time. But this is not to complain. This is rather to also convey something hopeful, that step by step, by doing all these things, I got more and more invited. I gave a lot of talks at both physics conferences, and I'm here now. So I very much promote also this step by step trajectory, because in the end, by funding myself and taking all these small steps, I am a professor at the university now. So it is, yeah, the taking small steps one by the time can be a very good method as well.
Okay, I'd had a similar thought to Alexi's, but I would have the way I thought of promoting my plea was to argue for the importance of improper training, both in physics and in history of science. and the sense of having training that transgresses what are currently disciplinary boundaries and disciplinary norms, particularly in teaching something like quantum mechanics, which is a historical subject and which we might have lots to bring to, but which is a subject that's taught in a very particular, strong way. So I wonder if we can work collectively on that as one aim. I talked about archives in the earlier session. My own aim for the archive is to collect from current science and to have postdoctoral positions that could be taken on from a historian of science, a philosopher of science, working scientists, or a science educator, but from all of them seen to be important. And maybe cultivating positions that clearly have that multifaceted prospect could be an important way of retaining an openness in the field and cultivating the multidisciplinarity that seems to be so important.
Are we going straight to the next question, or did you folks want to reply?
I can only agree. I don't have anything smart to say to add to this.
So I forgot to say something relevant to that. It goes in the, well, in everybody's question, how do we institutionalize? There is so while the Max Planck for Natural Science dies in Berlin, there was at least one thing, which is the research, the Radboud University Interdisciplinary Research Institute that was founded this year. It was at the inauguration this year by Klaas Ladsman, who has his own, who incarnates the mathematical physicist, the philosopher, and the historian, and he created an institute that represents these inner natures of him. And so that's an institute that has given, I think, 2 permanent positions to a philosopher, a historian, and then it's really interfaculty between history of science, philosophy, theology, I guess, for some, and physics. So these kind of things maybe are rare, but yeah, I just wanted to advertise these. That can be a virtuous example of spurious interpollination between this, and this starts, and they provide master courses, so there will be some students who will take this kind of education. I think education is extremely important to exactly not to just start putting together people who have been for 20 years a physicist or a historian, but form people who are like yeah, spurious or interdisciplinary in their formation from the beginning.
So it's a, you know, challenging, but also an inspiring conversation. And I have to say, I love this idea of promoting the value of improper training. I think I'm a poster child for that, coming to history of physics from law. But you know, there's so much that's been said, and that's been a spark for ideas from the back of the room to the front of the room. These questions about who are we talking to, who is the audience, and how do we fund that conversation? I see those as the 2 themes that have been emerging here. And I think they're related. So insofar as we may be talking to physicists, it's valuable to remind that part of our audience that physicists have always historically been involved in outreach and in social activism. You know, the field of physics that I've been tying into starts with this story about quantum archaeology, right? That there was a dive into the history of research in order to generate ideas about how to move new research forward. And it's not obvious that all practicing physicists will have heard that story, or at least not heard it recently. So to the extent that historians can convey those kinds of stories to practitioners, there seems to me to be a lot of value in building those relationships. And building on what Will shared, I think institutional relationships are very valuable. In the United States, we've got the American Institute of Physics that, of course, predominantly is focusing on practicing physicists, practitioners, but they're also creating space for historians and philosophers through the Forum for History and Philosophy of Physics. And so inserting ourselves in those spaces helps to expand the dialogue. In terms of the role that historians can play in inspiring physics as well, those conversations build bridges for expansive practices, more inclusive practices, and for reminders that physicists have a history of engagement socially from everything, starting, well, not starting, but just conceptually. One example, pugwash, professional societies that offer lobbying training so that there can be social statements made. Physicists through APS have been organizing at least as early as the 1970s to make statements about human rights abuses in Russia, concerns about warfare in Vietnam. And so all of us who are doing research in archival histories are likely to come across examples where our subjects touched on these historical moments. And if we can surface that kind of dialogue in cross-disciplinary conversation, I think we do everyone a service. We do our field a service, we do ourselves as individuals a service, and we do the broader transformation of the physics community a service as well, and then hopefully can stand as an example instead of being at the back of the line for inclusion, progress and acceleration toward a more open approach.
We agree. All right. For our sins, I will keep you in the sweltering room a few moments longer. For your good deeds, I will hand the microphone over to Jinyan.
Okay, thank you for all the panelists for the inspiring the audience discussion. What the Jinyan and I was trying to do in China recently is last year when we organized the very first history of physics session in the annual meeting of the Chinese Philosophical Society and the Physics Society. Okay. Yeah, Physical Society, Chinese CPS. This year we're going to continue in September. But I also like the idea history for physics, but in my mind is a history for physicists. But for that purpose, I think personally I need to learn, and I guess anyone want to enter this field need to learn the language of physicists. So I would call for AIP or anyone who is interested, maybe try to organize some kind of a session or online something or workshop asking for some maybe retired physicists to give us some primer training, I mean, into this field, especially for a highly technical field, the quantum mechanics. And if my personally, I have been right now, I'm transferring from history of relativity to history of quantum technically to understand some of the technical papers. So I would like to learn some courses, history of mechanics or mechanics course, quantum mechanics courses. But I was thinking taking courses from physics department, but that would take too much time for me. I can't afford it. So some kind of crash courses would be very helpful. In my idea, I would suggest that. But another thing I would like to also raise that I think whatever diversified direction we're going to develop in this group series, that I hope we don't will go down to the direction of the HSS. Personally, probably this is so offending. I would say I personally feel the annual meeting of the HSS become less and less attractive because I personally feel I can learn less and less about the history of science, about the science. So I would echo the call that Thomas Kuhn's on his deathbed, he gave a last call to Heilbronn, and his last words, according to Heilbronn, was keep the faith. Don't leave science out of our field. And also recently, I think Dan Cavalis also gave a Peyton lecture in New York. He also called that to attention that we should, I think, because of diversification and the social context, this kind of thing for history of science was helpful in broaden the direction of research in our field. But there's a dangerous trend. I think the people tend to ignore science content, scientific content of our field. And also, I think because of that, the scientists in general and the physicists in particular felt and will have a larger distance from us. And the history of historian of physics or philosopher of physics, this kind of thing. That's my comment.
Any reaction?
I think the idea of crash courses in physics for historians is a really great idea. And I wonder why I never had this idea before. I'm not sure. But someone should offer such a course. Yeah, I agree. Yeah.
Maybe I can add that at various universities in the Netherlands now, like Leiden and Groningen, they offer courses in quantum mechanics and courses in cosmology for all non-physicists. So maybe that's a start.
All right, well, we've got an ambitious agenda and a lot of work cut out for us. We're going to need energy, so let's go to lunch, shall we?
I would like to thank you, Will, for accepting to coordinate this roundtable. Thank you very much.